The value in learning to write isn't that you're going to go and write stuff. You may or may not. The value is in collecting up, organizing, discerning, distilling thought. That's going to be a transferable skill.
Welcome to Classical Etc. You're in the studio with Memoria Press.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Classical Etc. I'm Jessica Gardner, and I am here today with Paul Schaefer, Martin Cothran, and a very special guest, Mr. Andrew Pudewa. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew.
Thank you. It is a joy to be here with you.
Oh, we're so glad to have you. Andrew is here for our annual conference, but typically he serves at the Institute for Excellence in Writing. He founded that organization and is the director. He travels extensively and writes and speaks, but his most treasured role is the grandfather of 16 grandchildren and counting. Do I have that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 2 on the way.
2 on the way. And we are so glad to have you with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before we usually get into our conversation, Andrew, we go around and talk about what we're reading. So I won't put you in the hot seat yet. We'll start with Paul or Martin. Paul, what are you reading?
I was gifted a first edition of Sabatini's Hounds of God.
Oh.
Can't say it's in great condition, but it was a very thoughtful gift. And so I started reading that, which is fun. It's a good summer read. I pulled it out and I started reading it. My wife's like, "What are you reading?" I said, "I'm reading a romance novel," because it says right there on the front page, right? The Hounds of God, a romance novel. And so she got a good laugh out of it. But then, then the 2 girls were like, what are you reading? And I was like, this is a very old book, because it's 100 years old now, right? It's a very old book. And apparently the older one took that to heart. So when the younger one was going through a fit and she was like throwing stuff on the ground, she'd grab my book and throw it on the ground. And the older one was like, "Can't touch Paul's book." And so I was very, very pleased with that. So now I need to just get a bunch of old looking books and they won't touch my stuff.
Well, we should point out that term romance was used very differently 100 years ago than it is today.
Yeah.
It's not a love story. I mean, that can be a part of it, but a romance novel was an adventure novel. And so all those books at that time, H. Rider Haggard, Raphael Sabatini, all those were referred to as romance novels, but that just meant they were doing exciting things.
It was just fun to see my wife's eyes kind of go, "What are you reading?" Right? It's because
Not your normal fare.
not my normal fare. And I was like, "Yeah, it's an adventure story." So
Wonderful.
it's a good summer read.
Martin?
I am reading Winnie the Pooh over and over and over.
Have you
again.
memorized it?
I might as well have.
Is there a reason for this?
Well, I have this 2.5-year-old grandchild that Andrew met last night at dinner. And he is like big into Winnie the Pooh. And he just, the kids go through the stage where they want to hear the same story over and over and over again. And so you just have to do it. You sit down and you that's what they need. So I was trying to find other Winnie the Pooh stories that we could read instead of that one over and over. And these are the ones that they used to come with the little records, the little 45 RPM records.
Okay.
And I don't know where they got this from. So I actually got online and ordered a couple of other ones from that same, because that you have the Winnie the Pooh stories, the original ones by A.A. Milne, and there is something magical about those stories. And then I don't know if it was Disney or Disney bought the franchise later. They started doing the television shows, and whoever ran that completely got A.A. Milne's world, and they were really, really excellent. And they put out some really excellent movies. But like you could do a little golden book or something like that, and there's something different about how they're written. The author does not get their old. And I was just noticing things like the ones that are not very good. There's a lot of narration, and they're not letting the characters do the talking because it's the characters who are exciting. And just different things about the way you can write something and really take some of the magic out of it. You really have to, you got to get the world. You got to get the funny aspects of the characters. And if you don't get that, and you don't let them talk, and you just describe, then it's not the same thing. So yeah, we're just discovering new things about children's literature because we have to read the same story over and over and over again.
That's right. How about you, Andrew?
Well, in a similar vein, I could say, because I'm always several books at the same time. One is Why We Remember, which is a nonfiction by a neuroscientist about how memory works. And that's been very interesting. In obedience to you, Martin, and listeners don't necessarily know this, but Martin is my personal book coach. He's been serving in this role for well over a decade. I recruited him when I realized I was getting old fast and I wouldn't be able to read all the books that I should before I die. So I needed someone to advise me.
It's a hard job, but somebody's got to do it.
It is, because I'm not necessarily the most obedient, but I am over halfway through Jayber Crow.
Ooh.
And so I will reserve comment until I have completed my first full Wendell-Berry novel. But like
That's your first Wendell-Berry novel?
I've tried.
Really?
Yeah, I have had a hard time just getting past the first. It's slow. It's very slow.
Yeah, you have to embrace the slowness.
Yeah, and I couldn't read slow until, in obedience, I did slog all the way through Moby Dick. and that changed the way I read. Really, it did. But in the same vein as Martin, I have rediscovered the phenomenal writing of Roald Dahl in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And of course, I read this book as a kid. I loved it. And I saw a copy for 50 cents at a used curriculum fair. I thought I could read that to the grandchildren. So I did, and I started reading it. And I looked at it for decades. But he's brilliant. He's just brilliant writer. He builds the vocabulary right into the dialogue. So the kids are just expanding their synonyms for all sorts of words. And then the thing I most noted is you'd be reading and then you might pause for a minute, take a breath, or maybe it's the end of a section. And one of the kids would ask a question. And the very next sentence is the answer to the question. And this has happened a dozen times.
Oh.
So I just realized this guy is a brilliant, well understanding children. He understands children so well. And I'm kind of envious of writers who can do that. I don't think I could write a good children's book.
And he understands what the next question is that they're going to be asking. Or like, what would tickle their imagination that would then say, well, what about this?
Yeah. And it equally captured the 11-year-old, the 8-year-old, and the just turned 6-year-old, who usually is the one that doesn't want to read books. She wants to play and wrestle and do stuff. But even she said, read more. So I've enjoyed that.
That's incredible. Oh, well, Andrew, you are here at our conference here in Louisville this week, and you're even speaking today. You've spoken yesterday. What is the topic for today's talk that you're giving?
Well, today I'm on the track with Cheryl Swope and the Simply Classical, which I have loved everything she's done and said. It's been so great to see that thing just explode and be so successful for so many. So I'm speaking on combi work to composition, kind of a pathway of learning writing through imitation. And so I'm tweaking it a little bit for her purpose. And then at the end of the day, I'm doing a talk called However Imperfectly, Lessons Learned from 30 Years of Teaching. So that has 7 points. And it's I'm going to have to tighten it up a little bit because you guys only give me 40 minutes.
Oh, that's not a long time to give us everything you've learned in 30 years.
It's true. So it's a highlight tour, but I think I can give people a good chuckle and something to think about.
Yeah.
And, so hopefully people who aren't here can access recordings online and participate. This is the best conference, honestly. Of all the things I do, Hillsdale was good, but this is even better. Plus, I get to meet Martin's grandchildren.
You're the draw.
Yeah.
You're the draw, Martin. Yeah.
He met him last night and survived.
Well, can you tell us a little bit more about your composition talk? You said it was copywork
to composition.
Okay.
Well, a lot of people, especially the modern view, is writing is all about creativity and self-exploration, discovery, expression. And there's truth to that, but that's not how you teach children to do it, right? It's a basic skill. And like all basic skills, whether it's, in athletics or sports or music or painting and drawing, you don't just throw instruments or paper at a kid and say, here, express yourself.
Right.
But that's what the schools have been doing, more or less, way too young for a long time. Consequently, the reaction against that is, well, let's look at tradition. And you can go back as recently as probably 120, 150 years ago. And that was how children started to learn to write and do handwriting and spell words and understand punctuation and grammar. It was just by copying beautiful language.
Well, and you see they do it instinctively.
It is.
Too.
It is a natural faculty of children to imitate, to copy.
Right. And it's largely us as adults going, well, that would be boring. And then thinking, well, then it would be boring for them. And it's not, because they're mastering something because they want to be like the adults, and they don't have the facility with forming the letters or anything, but they can copy.
What's interesting is it's not actually boring if you're copying something that's beautiful and good and true. When I first started really thinking about the value of just straight copy work, even for older kids, we think of it, okay, 6, 7, then you're done. But even for children 9, 10, 11, I tried an experiment on myself where I copied the entire book of John by hand on paper. And it's slow going. If you're being neat and careful, you might get, 500 words in 15 minutes. It's slow. But it becomes kind of a contemplation as well, because you read a phrase or a sentence, you try to copy it, you look back at what you were trying to copy, see if it's correct. And so you're reading the thing 3, 4, 5 times in the process of copying it, and it becomes a contemplation. And you notice all sorts of things you wouldn't notice if you were just kind of watching the words go by or hearing it being read in church or something. So I would commend everyone that experiment, a self-experiment. Just pull out, your favorite book of the Bible and just start copying it on paper and see what happens in your mind and heart.
Well, and the thing about copying and writing things down, sometimes repeatedly, is that you're working with the grain of the child's own psychology. They like to do things over and over again, like reading,
like Winnie the Pooh.
And so this whole modern romanticist idea of creativity and innovation it totally goes against that idea. Doing something over and over again, you want to hand a child a blank sheet of paper and say, just think of something that you leave. There's no framework. There's no limitation of what you want them to do. That is a frightening experience for a lot of children. That was frightening for me whenever it happened to me.
I remember that.
And if you give them something that they can imitate, this is we don't say this enough in the classical education movement, that probably the chief mode of learning in classical education is imitation. Imitating great things.
Great things.
So have them copy a great thing. This is how a lot of the classical artists work. It's even how a lot of the more innovative modern artists work, and it enabled them to be innovative. The fact that Picasso goes into the Louvre and copies the masters over and over again. That's how they were enabled to become innovative even. So it's the root even of innovation.
But I would also say that if we give a student something to copy, before they copy it, we should talk about it, right? And help them understand a little bit of like why this is important. What's beautiful about this? What are we doing here? Because otherwise, I mean, children have a phenomenal ability to just grab stuff with no thought about what it is. And it without this, like, you have to be able to explain this back to me, but let me give you some things to think about as you copy this, in order to start helping them focus on what they're doing. Because I've seen children that have facts and information memorized, and when you ask them anything about it, I don't know what that means.
Right.
But I'm not sure that you have to do that, particularly before when children are very young. If you look at nursery rhymes, for example, you don't need to discuss 1 foot up, 1 foot down. That's the way to London town. It just is. And I think there's a magic to a lot of poetry and children's literature that they just need to absorb.
No, I think you're right. But if we're talking about copy work, right, we're talking about some sort of like academic, like I'm taking this on now. And it depends on the age of the child, right? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember saying the Lord's Prayer the first time with the 7-year-old in my home, right? She'd never heard it before. And immediately she says, and I'm trying to do this so that this becomes something of memory. But the first time she says, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. And so, we just went line by line, as she's going to bed, this is what this means. And so there's going to be this gradation of like, sure, she could have just memorized it, and I could have said, don't worry about it, just memorize it. But there is, by that age, there is some desire to understand what are we saying here, right?
Yeah. Well, but I think when they're very young, there's sort of a music to children's literature. And you often quote Mr. Suzuki, 10,000 times, then comes understanding.
Yes.
So sometimes the repetition itself does a lot of that.
It does. And you're also thinking it would be appropriate stuff. So, if children are copying Aesop fables, right, they're going to absorb wisdom just from the story. And then, talking about it, of course. I wouldn't want anyone to feel like, oh no, I have to discuss this with my child before, we have her copy it. I think
you're
jump in
older.
and do it.
You're talking about
right, but I also think there's you've got the grand grindian extreme, right? And that's what I'm trying to just warn us off from, because it's in sort of the spot in our world where we are. We need to hammer memory, imitation.
Right, and we could fall.
You could fall too far and say like there's actually a beauty in doing both. And what we're trying to recover is this memory, this imitation. This needs to be recovered, but lest people hear us saying, just stick it in front of them, make them copy it, and then never grow into that understanding. And I was thinking about this, the child with the Lord's Prayer, right? If she had grown up in a house that was saying the Lord's Prayer, every day, every week, whatever it is, she would have memorized it with no thought about what it meant, right? 2, 3, 4 years old. And this maybe 7 years old is the appropriate time to be saying, well, what does that mean? Right. And so but if you come up with a brand new poem and introduce that to your 7-year-old, you may want to actually talk about what we're talking about.
It's like my wife, who said when she was very young, she thought God's name was Art. Who art in heaven.
Isn't that funny?
And these little misunderstandings. But I get your point, because there's always a good balance between the mechanics of something and the spirit of the thing. And so wisdom being always in the balance there.
Well, and this is where a taxonomy of learning like Dorothy Sayers does come in handy. If you're talking about that early stage where they do like to just imitate, and then you get into that, when they start thinking more dialectically, that's the time you start, asking questions about.
Or they'll start asking you the questions.
Yeah, they will.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I want to go back to this idea you had of contemplation, right? Of writing, and it forces you to contemplate.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was having a conversation yesterday about forcing children to handwrite things at a high school level, because when I was teaching last year, I was like, I told the students earlier on in the year, I will take a typed paper, but I will be disappointed. I would rather it be handwritten because you will do better work with it being handwritten.
It slows you down.
Yeah. And and this is in a philosophy class. So the very end of the year, when I got to and I had a few kids whose handwriting really slowed me down when I was grading, and I ended up saying, like, look, in the rubric, the way I would put it was, first several papers were 2 pages handwritten, 4 pages handwritten, and then if they said, well, if I type it, well, give me half that length, right? And roughly speaking, and I said, I don't really care how long it is, as long as I'm more concerned about what you say. And then in the last rubric, I said, give me 1,500 words, 1,500 pages. Ooh,
I was going to say
1,500 words, and which is roughly 8 pages handwritten or 4 pages typed. Excuse me, I'm trying not to sneeze into the microphone. And so I had way more students type the last paper because of the way the rubric was framed, and I noticed quality of work was worse.
So there's some really interesting research that's been done in the last decade and a half using fMRI scanning to see how the brain is working during different activities that people do. And they found that when people are writing on paper as opposed to typing on a keyboard, more of their brain is activated. And the area that's activated is the subdominant hemisphere of the cortex.
Oh yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So we
I'm
think
sorry,
of
that doesn't mean anything to me.
Language, executive function, logic. That's the dominant brain, the dominant cortex. So in right-handed people, left brain. So we get that left brain, right brain. And then the right brain, or the subdominant cortex, is the artistic, intuitive side, right? So when you write on paper, you observe more bilateral cortical activity than you do people typing. So I think that is kind of some interesting scientific support for the idea that people do think better, more creatively, perhaps a little more intuitively or artistically, when they are writing on paper. And we might note that although typewriters were available, Lewis and Tolkien wrote everything they wrote on paper. Lewis wrote everything he wrote on paper with a fountain pen, with a dip in the inkwell fountain pen, even though modern technologies were certainly available. So I think we can, work with that, and certainly, with folks out there trying to decide should their 12-year-old type or write on paper, I think there's a good argument to be saying keep on paper for as long as possible, as long as reasonable, because you'll develop skills, both, technical skills as well as perhaps better thinking.
Yeah,
by doing that.
This is another indication of how old I am, but you may remember this, is the desks that they had, and there was still the little round
indentation
in the desk for the inkwell.
You're older than I am. A whole year.
Well, it was worth a try.
I don't remember that. But.
Oh yeah, I remember that very well.
But I think that brings up a nice point about, like, what education is not about them producing, it's about them being formed. And this goes back to, Martin, you were saying about, right, this in writing where it's not copy work, but it's just like write something, and it's very intimidating. But we're asking them to do that because we think everybody should be producing new creative ideas,
right?
Rather than, no, these 18 years that we're spending on this, really, the student should be doing it the slowest, most laborious way to master.
Well, it's a furnishing of the mind, right? And one of your favorite authors, Louis L'Amour, reportedly said, an author's mind is like a coffee cup. You don't get something out unless you put something in. Right?
There you go.
And paraphrase, I think. But we see that with kids, and they say, I don't know what to write. I don't know what to say. I can't think of anything. Well, it's probably because we haven't attended to the input side
Mm.
as much as we should. That's why the memorization of language, the copy work, the learning structures and learning style elements, that's filling up that coffee cup of the brain. And then at some point they will have something they really want to communicate to the world, and they'll have so much better resources to be able to do
Well, and
that.
the older ideal was to study the classics, study the masters until you were in college or even, postgraduate work before you were expected to start doing something innovative in scholarship.
Mhm.
Right now, we just let people loose and it's, free range.
And I think there's a reaction against this
Uh-huh,
kind of
yeah.
progressive modernism. I was at Hillsdale College recently for their K-12 teachers convention. And so it was very interesting to find out how many of these teachers are also going to the copy work, imitation, write on paper.
Mm.
Even in middle school, I met a lot of teachers who were, and they're in public charter schools, many of them. But there's this reaction against, well, let's just use technology to make life easier and better for everyone.
Can we talk about that? What questions are you getting these days about technology? I can probably guess a couple, like AI.
Yeah,
Can you speak to that?
That, recently someone said to me, with the advent of, electronic everything, ebooks and video and screen-based apps to learn everything, is there still going to be a market for printed paper materials to teach children with? And the other question is, well, with AI, now it can write as well or better than most people. So are we going to need to teach that anymore? And I think there's a swing. I think there's a certain segment of the more mature, objective people who realize, yes, screens and AI and tech and calculators can do stuff faster and maybe more accurately than most people. But we're not teaching basic skills because we're always going to use them, right? We took algebra. I'm very glad I took algebra. When's the last time I used a quadratic formula? When I was in algebra, 50 years ago. But the value is in learning to think better. The value in learning to write isn't that you're going to go and write stuff. You may or may not. The value is in collecting up, organizing, discerning, distilling thought. That's going to be a transferable skill, whether you have to write memos or emails or reports or articles or not.
Well, I think I've said this on the podcast before, but like technology makes the dumb dumber and the smart smarter.
Right. It amplifies whatever you have.
Yeah. And so if we don't give our students those basic skills, what the technology is going to do is suck them into basically the entertainment section side, where all they're doing is consuming. Whereas when we talk about production, right, when you get to be an adult and you're ready to contribute to society, that technology can help you be more contributory. But if you don't have those skills, it won't be.
Yeah, a really good book on this is The Flickering Mind by Todd Oppenheimer. And it's old now. It's at least 15 years old. I wish he would, if he's still alive, I don't even know. I wish he would revise it and make it more current, because people think, 15 years old, no value there. But he studied schools and compared high-tech, science magnet schools, computer for every kid, and then the zero-tech schools, Montessori, Waldorf, really poor Christian schools. And he found an inverse correlation. The more screens in a classroom, the lower the basic skills of reading, writing, and calculating. But at the end of the book, he says pretty much what you said. He said, technology will amplify whatever you have. So if you have organized, productive, efficient, focused people, they will become more organized, productive, efficient, and focused. If you have disorganized, inefficient, unproductive people and you give them technology, they will become more that way. And then he leaves the reader at the end of the book with a question, what's your average fifth grader like? Have they reached a point of being organized and productive and efficient? And
Well, what are some of the other conversations you're having recently in the classical education world?
Well, I think there's a shift more toward what's the underlying philosophical foundation? What are the guidelines that should help us navigate this ever-growing world of classical education, as opposed to just give me the curriculum? There's still some people who are in this, I believe you, now tell me what to do. But I think the conversations, particularly, at the conventions where we do the classical panel and things, are some pretty good deeper level questions. And they always seem to intersect with, well, how can I, as an adult, as a teacher, as a parent, whatever, be a better classical educator rather than what should I buy and give to the kids? So that's kind of exciting.
It's becoming, it's changing the adults.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And I mean, in classical education, the movement, I think that has always needed to be a multi-generational project, right? I mean, because we've got parents coming to buy curriculum now that were homeschooled with Memoria Press curriculum, right?
Really.
And so they themselves were formed in a way that their parents were not, right? So the parents were really struggling to give them what they could, right? And trying to give them a further leg up. And now these students that are now parents will be able to do that. Yeah.
Right. And that's what we want for the renewal of the whole, is the generational improvements.
Yeah. And like you said, when we do these classical panels at a lot of the homeschool conferences, a lot of the questions kind of express a kind of insecurity about the ability to do this.
How can I teach something I don't really know?
How can I teach something I don't know? And the assumption behind the question is at odds with the truth on this, which is that the best way to learn is to teach. And particularly when you have materials that really has the instruction in it, it just needs a relatively intelligent person to read it and go through. I mean, I did not know Latin and ended up teaching it for 20 years because I got the program that Cheryl gave me, which was the Henley Latin program at the time, which the Forms series is based on. That's an easier version of Henley.
And see, he could be reading Virgil, but he's reading Winnie the Pooh.
Yeah, that's right.
There is a Winnie the Pooh in Latin.
Yes.
Start reading that to your 2.5-year-old grandson.
In Latin.
I know. Well, the Cat in the Hat one was written by a fellow just down the road here at the University of Kentucky. Yeah.
But I think it is very exciting to see this generational motion. Out at Hillsdale, I think half the teachers I met were either homeschool graduates who grew up and decided they wanted to be teachers for some reason I still find odd, or it's a calling, it's a vocation, or homeschool graduate moms who raised their kids, launched them, and now they've got a good decade or two, and they're coming at it with such enthusiasm, and then they can go get some degree. Fortunately, charter schools are more flexible in who they can hire than in most states than regular public schools. So they have a wider range of really excited people to choose from. And these K-12 school networks they're growing so rapidly. And more parents are now nose to nose with the failings of schools their kids are in. And they're borderline between panic and desperate for a better option. And I'm so grateful to be part of the world that can help move them to a better option. And of course, the range from 5-day-a-week classical schools to hybrid schools, cottage schools, micro schools, co-ops, the whole landscape of education is just becoming more diverse. And like agriculture, that's a good thing, I think.
Paul, our farmer in residence.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is interesting to see the parallels, because in the same time, there's this swing in education that people are saying we want something better. Same things happen in agriculture. People are saying we want something better. But in the education realm, where I'm worried, and I'm seeing this actually in both realms, where like in the agriculture realm with regenerative, right? People are now saying, X, Y, and Z practice is regenerative. And I'm seeing this in the educational world where they're saying X, Y, and Z is classical. And I'm like, where in the world are you thinking that that's a classical idea, right? We have someone working in Memoria Academy who his like nephew or somebody was graduating from a local public magnet school here, which is nowhere near anything classical. But at graduation, they said we're classically educating our kids. And classical is becoming so big now that it's just a word that people are now using and saying, we want this too. And so I am worried about the dilution of it, the people that like Cheryl O and like you guys that were working hard to get this movement started. It was because it was an act of love, right? Like there was passion here. And then as something like that gets bigger and bigger, the message can start to become weaker and weaker.
And that obviously has happened throughout history with faith. It gets diluted, but that doesn't mean there aren't still there's ways that people can kind of get a foot in the door and then start to see where they are and then go for the better option. So I understand that kind of watered down classical in name, trying, hoping to be that way as not entirely a bad thing if it helps point people in the right direction and they just pursue truth to the end.
But what we would encourage people is don't be content with just getting your foot in the door. Ask, as you're talking about, the conversations are becoming more, what are the principles here?
Right.
What's foundations? Those sorts of questions are phenomenal because it's going to help lead you deeper and deeper.
Which is why conferences like this are so good, because you come and you get to be reminded of those truths that you knew, but get, you lose track of some of those core principles with just the noise of it. The noise of
it seems to me the most
schools.
important role of classical education has been to remind us what education is. And you do have these people who it's become a popular thing now because it's the only thing that's growing, I think, in education right now is the classical movement. Almost all the new schools opening up are classical schools.
The kind of STEM magnet schools, you hardly see these anymore.
Right. That's right.
Interesting.
And so people are finally, I think, trying to kind of realize, well, they know it's popular, so they're wanting to use the word, but they don't necessarily know what it is yet. And I think that, when we came up with our slogan, saving Western civilization one student at a time, that was meaningful. That was saying something that it's what we are about. We are trying to pass on our civilization. And how do you do that? You do it through a focus on the arts and sciences. And for years, schools have been going off on all kinds of tangents of things that are the newest thing, and they're forgetting what the original idea of education was.
I texted you a Chesterton quote yesterday, but since you didn't respond, I'm assuming you did not read.
My phone was on Do Not Disturb.
Yeah, but I thought you would love this one. It just popped up somewhere. The problem with education as a subject, I'm probably paraphrasing slightly, or the problem with the subject of education is that it isn't a subject. It is the passing on of tradition. It's exactly what you're saying. Yeah. And yet we sit around and say, how can we study education and do it better? Right? So there's a cognitive dissonance there.
And maybe we could study our civilization.
And do it better.
And here's a start.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thanks for joining us today, Andrew. Appreciate your time in between conference talks and all your travel. It's a privilege to have you here. And thanks, Martin and Paul.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us. We will be back next time. Thanks for joining us today on Classical Etc. by Memoria Press. If you like what you heard, Please like, subscribe, or share this episode or comment. We love to hear your questions and your comments. If you want to learn more about Memoria Press, please go to memoriapress.com. This has been Classical Etc. We're so glad you joined us, and we'll see you next time.